So welcome everybody to the 13th session of Presenting Our Presence. Can't believe it was just one short year ago where we launched this series of Presenting Our Presence at the University of Alberta, where we are amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples who work and study at the University of Alberta. My name is Florence Glanfield. I'm Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research, and our series is co-hosted with my colleague,
Cindy Gaudet, Dr. Janice Cindy Gaudet. Happy to be here again with the both of you.
And throughout the past year, we've had an amazing third co-host that has joined and helped us work through the technicalities of presenting our presence. And I'll invite Kyle to just introduce himself formally.
Joe says Kyle Napier Sulier, Shettronaster, Kulu Tibetchanastara, Don Sera to talk to you about Indigenous languages and intellectual property. So that's something I'm really passionate about. But yeah, this whole last year with POP, I've been the kind of behind the scenes person that is ensuring that everything goes right technically, that we upload right, that we know how to work with the RSS feeds, whatever that means, and broadcast POP, to get it out there as a vodcast and podcast. So it's just been such an honor working with both you, Florence, and with you, Cindy, to release this and to work with community to release this. And so one thing I'm particularly excited to talk about today is what it means to release a podcast on our own terms and right, sovereignty, authority, and autonomy over our words. And that's what really draws it, I think, a few steps further into intellectual property and what that means around ensuring that we are protecting our rights as Indigenous peoples, and we're protecting our words and our thoughts and our ontologies and our epistemologies and our ways of being and teaching and learning and growing and speaking. And so that's something I'm really passionate to talk about today. But anyway, Masicho, thank you for the introduction.
Well, and thank you, Kyle, because that leads and gives our audience an insight into the conversation we're going to have today. And so today we have invited Kyle to be our guest on Presenting Our Presence so that all of you could learn a little bit more about what drives Kyle and his passions. And just to say, we've been very fortunate to be able to work alongside Kyle over the last year. And so we're going to start this. Kyle's already introduced some of his passions, but we also have some questions for you, Kyle. So I'm going to invite Cindy to start us off with the conversation. And I know we'll continue to hear the wisdom that you've come to know and you'll be able to share with us around intellectual property. So Cindy, thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence, and merci, Kyle, for being here. And, yes, we mentioned, so at every podcast, we mentioned you're like our technical digital guru behind the scenes. And I just want to point that what you brought to this table in this preparing and imagining and dreaming and co-creating POP is way more than just editing our digital stories and making sure that we've all have sovereignty over, we get the last say in our words. And I have to just really salute you and acknowledge that what I've learned in terms of the stewarding of our stories through digital, and you brought us that awareness on a global level, what's happening in terms of intellectual property, and really making that part of our philosophy and our decision-making process throughout, and engaging as a co-host as well with some of our guests. So just just want to so grateful, and your passion around language, we've spoken about and shared in terms of there's so many things you're involved in. When we were talking, I was like, thinking about, oh my goodness, you teach at Mount Royal University, you're at Deshenta, you're co-chair on native lands, you are working on this project, you've done other RA-ships with other of our colleagues at the U of A. Your favorite project, you told me, was fry bread photography. All of these things that we've learned about ourselves and each other through pop and everything that we do and what we're passionate about. And you always bring so much enthusiasm and love for the ethics that we're responsible for and that we carry. And so you keep bringing that to the forefront in all our visits, right? And as we're preparing with our guests and our visitors as well. So I just really want to acknowledge the integrity and the ethics that you bring to this work. And you know, what is behind this philosophy or these principles of your community engaged research, which is something that is evidently that you're passionate about and you care so deeply about? How would you describe that?
Well, that's exactly it, right? And that digs the hole even further than intellectual property and copyright. It is rematriation and respect. And so largely the work that we do is guided by the principles of co-creation and, again, right, sovereignty and autonomy over our words. So this is the opportunity for us to share our stories on our own platform. And very rarely does that happen. But because of the digital age, you know, some theorists say we're in Industrial Revolution 4.0, which allows us to have, you know, access to technical tools like this and the computer that, you know, that we're communicating with, or, you know, that the viewer is using to watch this or listen to this right now. Because of the ubiquity of these tools, we also have a ubiquity of co-creational capacity. So it's not just a matter of us creating individually, but us creating as a community. And that's what pop is. That's where pop really resonates with me, is that it spreads out across communities. Each person being featured has their own specific audience in which those topics resonate with them. And so anyone who's involved in the space of broadcasting and Indigenous language work, or Indigenous or digital stewardship of Indigenous knowledges, it becomes bound within the consciousness of ethical principles of guiding those digital resources along the way. And there are experts in the space, right? I really look to Dr. Jennifer Wemigwan around the work of digital bundles or knowledge bundles, which are, you know, treating digital recordings such as, you know, the pop interviews with Indigenous knowledge holders or academics or students, which are in their own ways, no matter their pursuits, knowledge holders. And they're going through this knowledge gaining process with an Indigenous lens. So the conversations that emerge from that and the type of knowledge that grows from that type of foundation is itself Indigenous knowledge. Now, here's the challenge, is that the government of Canada does not assert appropriate copyright protections over Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous knowledge communities. So for instance, we were talking right before this episode about, you know, what is the appropriate way to describe June in our Indigenous languages, right? The moon month, not June, the Gregorian month, but the moon month that occurs in June. And so, you know, we were talking about, you know, what it would be in Pasquao-Nahiawan, right, in Plains Cree, or in Denadetlaneati, like my language. And we were talking about the variances of that. Well, that's not protected by any intellectual property or copyright. We look it up, it's in different resources. If someone in Germany wanted to publish that, a calendar of all in an Indigenous language, they could do so without the appropriate community protocols. And so, you know, what we are sharing, or what Indigenous knowledge holders share in digital spaces is if not done right, unprotected by protocol. And when it's unprotected by protocol, it's out in the world, it's out in the space, and becomes vulnerable to exploitation, to extraction, to appropriation. and worse, right? And so, right, misinterpretation, misrepresentation, capitalization, like profiteering off of such knowledges, and so that's why it's really important to be deeply considerate about the space of intellectual property in Indigenous languages, in Indigenous broadcasting, in our own representation. Heck, even in our memes or the photos that we put online, on social media or whatever, is, what we put online, because of the contract that Canada is in with the United States and Mexico, we are bound to the USMCA, the United States-Mexico Canada Agreement, which, because of Disney, asserts that up to a year after our death and then 70 years after, that is when what we have created, that's when our copyright expires, right? 70 years after our death, that calendar year. So what our ancestors have created, or visual representations of our ancestors that are out there, are completely up to exploitation, extraction, and appropriation. They are vulnerable. And so what we are creating today, we have to be very conscious that it's not just like multi-generational, like the next generation. We have to think 40 years, 400 years, and 4,000 years in the future. And that's what's so important for us as people with the ability to create, is that we have to be conscious not just of the ancestors before us, but as Dr. Candace Gala says, the types of ancestors that we want to be. And so in direct consciousness of that, I really want to make it clear to whoever's listening, just to research and be aware of your rights when it comes to copyright, when it comes to intellectual property. Look globally, right? Sometimes Creative Commons is a better global tool for asserting those rights. Or if you look to like the World Intellectual Property Organization, they are currently modifying their intellectual property regulations and laws. So, and that's globally, but then you need to look to your own nation, right? Different Indigenous governments are, through their self-government processes, coming up with intellectual property clauses or copyright clauses around protecting their own rights. And that's really important. Even the federal government last September released a funding pocket, which was, I think, $60,000 per grantee for different Indigenous nations to develop IP copyright or protocols. So what we're going to see in the next few years is really going to be fascinating. It's going to be the results of either independent or co-creational capacity development of IP laws. Even before that, like if we look to 1996, I'm really inspired by, and I'm going to get the order wrong here, but it's the Lakota-Dakota-Nakota Declaration of War against appropriators of Indigenous spirituality. And so that in itself is not a law, it's not a license, it's a statement, it's a declaration of war. And sometimes, as Glenn Coulthard or Frantz Fanon might suggest, Dr. Glenn Coulthard and Dr. Frantz Fanon might suggest, is that sometimes the responses don't need to be so tame, And so that is where I find a beauty in the ferality of our work, is just coming at this consciousness. I had considered whether to go in this with a script or with any notes, but again, just really recognizing, what comes from the heart. For the Nehiyawewen understanding listeners, what comes from Dabwewin, like truth, right? The sound of your heart. And so just drawing again on Dr. Jennifer Wemagwan for the chapter Dabwewin about truth and heart in how we share through our digital media and our knowledge bundles. So Masi Cho for the opportunity to talk about that.
Kyle, because you certainly brought that awareness to my work, and now I'm thinking about it in a whole different ways as a result of your research, your knowledge, your passion. And what I find also quite intriguing is your what you're passionate about and how it ties to also your passion about language revitalization. And can you share with us this project, one of your passion projects, and how you've taken these elements of copyright and intellectual property into more than consideration? I'd say you've brought it into a decolonial praxis, like you're actually implementing, living, and assuring the sovereignty of that work. But first, share us, if you wouldn't mind, this project that you've been working on that's tied to that which you love and that which comes, like you said, from your heart and your intelligence.
Well, I'm collaborating with Elder Eileen Beaver to create a video game. And the video game as an idea was born out of a collaboration with Elder Eileen Beaver and myself around the thesis that I had written for my master's and that she had supervised. And so during interviews with her, she had mentioned how important it would be to develop a video game. And I think this is actually inspired from her late son, that the video game should be titled Dene Quest. And it should be a language learning video game. And so for the last year and a half, I've been working every single weekend on producing Dene Quest in Cause. And so it's a language learning video game that starts, it's a gradual immersion. So you have, it's written entirely in Dene Dedleneati and pronounced phonetically and scripted, all of that in Dene Dedleneati with written transliterations underneath that allow a non-Dene Yati speaker to follow along until that player hits a certain point in various regional language learning areas like fishing, harvesting, hunting, tree cutting, bird identification, all of these different areas until you hit a certain point, and then you no longer need some of those basic words, right? You have an understanding of the foundations and it moves it along. And so that largely draws on the work of Dr. Neoxit Grey Morning with the accelerated second language acquisition model, the ASLA, and also, the work that Eileen and I have done through our mentor apprentice program. So she is my language teacher, and and for anyone who's in a mentor apprentice program, the onus is not just on your teacher to teach you the language, but you also have to take a bit of accountability on yourself and to reach out to community and other speakers of other similar dialects and speak with them and understand, what's the differences, tonalities, hear it not just from one person. So as part of my own language learning journey, and because of a contract with the South Slave Divisional Education Council, I'm developing a video game, which it is, people are very, very excited. It is youth tested, elder approved. Kids are hooked, and so it's so far it's in the translation phase. So it's coded beginning to end, and it's a gift to the elders because there's one special place. There's 4 communities: Denenukwe, Tabachan, Hatodesche, and Fitzoke. Just like around Tunede, just like around Great Slave Lake, it's Fort Smith, Fort Resolution, Hay River, and Fitzoke. Well, once you go to the 4th community, there's a radio station, and you tell all the community members, we're setting up a feast in Rosh River, which used to be a real community until there was some very controversial action that took place in the late 50s where the school was set on fire. And so because the school was set on fire and there were people with children, they had to move to communities with a residential school. Well, this video game is a gift to those families that had to move away from Rosh River. And so by the time you get to the 4th community, you get on the radio, you tell everyone, we're hosting a feast in Rosh River, and then throughout the game, right, you're interacting with people, you're giving them, furs or meat or berries or bannock or whatever, and so and then whoever you've helped out along the way, they hear your voice on the radio and they go out to Rosh River, and now you have the 5th community, and you leave that community by sled dog team. So it's a beautiful narrative, and it's inspired wholly by the rich history that I'm connected to ancestrally, right? I'm Dene Nehio Métis, but everyone who's listening, right, you come from your own histories. And so what I really want to hear from in these next few years is like, you know, what narratives does this inspire you to journey on? You know, you don't need to be a video game developer. You don't even need to know how to create a podcast. You can create something again with your phone or with your family or with a picture book. You know, us creating media or us in the roles of broadcasting and storytelling or storying our journeys it is such a magical and beautiful process that we often I think as adults, we lose the, you know, we become bureaucratized and policied out of that creative notion and that creative inspiration that lives inside of all of us, right? But we can't live within the four walls. You know, I'm speaking in a room that has actually more than four walls excitedly, but you know, typically we're in these student learning environments with these four walls. Even, right, I'm coding this video game, right? It has four walls, the boundaries of the area, but we have to think within the space of people's ears, right? We have to think within the imagination of the person that is either playing the game, listening to a podcast, watching a movie, you know, reading, listening to the story, right, that you're telling them, right? You are a storyer. Whoever is listening to this, you, Cindy, you are a storyer. You, Florence, you are a storyer. And I find it so fascinating how we go about these processes individually, right? And so anyway, when it comes to intellectual property and copyright is, okay, so because of the contract with the South Slave Divisional Education Council, we're able to hire, I'm able to hire people to contribute to the game. And so because the game came out of a conversation with Elder Eileen Bieber, she has the trademark. She has the well, it's not a registered trademark, it's a temporary TM trademark, so temporarily trademark. But I cannot release the game as DeneQuest without her approval. So right now it's in draft form, but because she owns the trademark, that's hers, right? I have a copyright over the coding because I coded it, except for any of the parts that I ripped off online. But there's an excellent community right behind the game development program that I'm using. So I'm able to get like muskox and bison, and caribou, and dragonflies, and all of these things that are relevant to the boreal environment that I grew up in, right? Like where I grew up, there was 4 houses and there was an outhouse. That was, you know, I didn't necessarily grow up with a toilet right away, and so, you know, so the environment that I grew up in, I'm very just familiar with being surrounded by trees and just being itched at by bugs. So there's mosquitoes in the game, and you know, if you're not careful, they'll come and eat you. And so anyway. Respecting and acknowledging the intellectual property behind that is part of the contract allowed us also allowed me also to hire indigenous artists, right, graphic designers or illustrators. So any of the art which wasn't previously available, like the muskox and the bison, on a you know non-commercial license. So I'm going to release the game non-commercially, but I also used funding to create animal sprites that weren't available, like a porcupine. So I hired an Ojibwe artist, a Gwich'in artist, and a Dedlene artist, and so all of them Indigenous women that make up any of the other necessary complementary graphics for the game. So yeah, thank you for asking. It's definitely a passion project. I'm very excited for when it releases, and it's a super easy engine to work with. So if there are people interested, I want to be a video game designer, do it. Yeah, go to YouTube University, just look it up, watch YouTube for a week, and that's what I did. You know, and then now you can create. So it's really just that easy.
So Kyle, I'm now as an educator, I'm fascinated with this video game. And was there a sensibility of the age groups that you were targeting with this development and with the elders' advice and leadership?
That's exactly it. So it's designed for about grade 6 and up for students who are already in the Dene language program in the South Slave Divisional Education Council area. Specifically, speakers of T dialect, Dene Dedlaneati. So not Dene Sontlane, but T dialect, so Dene Dedlaneati, or T dialect Dene Sontlane. So it's around that age range. But so I've tested it. And people around that age, kids, they'll want to play it, they'll learn, they'll start making connections. That's what's really fascinating. They'll say like, hey, wait, I've seen this word. That's the word for like hook. But if that's hook, oh, that must be fishing rod, it's hook stick. And then so they start making connections. Or if they choose the berry picking route and not the fishing route, then they start counting the numbers of berries and oh, no, it's that. And as they start making associations, that's what I love seeing. And so, again, kid tested, elder approved. So when I say that, I mean people around that age range, they have a good time playing it. And then the elders that I've shown, they you know how sometimes elders are very honest and necessarily honest in a critique, right? So I need to be open to that, right? If you're creating for community, you need to be receptive to criticism, right? Otherwise it's gonna fall dead in the water, whatever it is you're working on. You need to be open to critique, and that's collaboration, right? And so with the involvement of multiple elders along the way, but predominantly Elder Eileen Beaver, who has been teaching Dedlaneati for 25 years within the SSDEC. So yeah, major passion project, and very accessible for anyone who's interested in creating a game. I taught my 9-year-old Inuk cousin how to create, and then he created a video game. So it is within people's means, yeah.
Well, and it seems to me that what will also be beautiful, although the game is targeted, I'm going to say, for that age group, once those, the ages there start talking about it at home, then I'm going to predict that it's going to actually shape family conversations about language. And perhaps even if the parents or the grandparents are not fluent speakers, they will want to see what is engaging the youth that are, or the children in this case, the grade 6 and up children. What's engaging them, and how can they get involved, and how can they begin to play the game? I'm going to suggest.
That's exactly it, right? Because people can't attain fluency through a video game, right? Not through Pimsleur, not through an app, not through whatever avenue people are taking to learn a game. Duolingo is probably more relevant than Pimsleur these days, but right, that in itself does not develop fluency. It takes families, it takes communities, and it takes those conversations, dialogue, and inspired dialogue, not scripted dialogue. It needs to be creative. So I had a conversation with the world's leading linguist, Dr. Noam Chomsky, about language revitalization. And so he said that it really is a matter of the community and the community needing to speak the language, right? So not just the matter of an individual, but how do all of the individuals come together to revitalize that language? And what's really fascinating, and we're going to see this in the next 2 months on August, I think August 17th, StatsCan is going to release their language data for the most recent 2021 StatsCan survey. And so what I predict we're going to see is more of an increase in people learning Indigenous languages as a second language. And so that was in 2016, that was the first time that we saw an uptick of people learning Indigenous language as a second language. But I predict that number is going to be higher during this survey. But unfortunately, at the same time, the people who know an Indigenous language as a first language is going down, right? And we know that because of, anyone who's attached or connected to Indigenous communities knows that, death is felt strongly and resoundingly. And many of our elders these last few years, it's been hard on them. It's been hard on their hearts, on their heads and their souls and their bodies. And so, we've just been seeing, of course, we've been losing some of the most valued members of our communities, right? Language speakers. And not to say that if you're not a language speaker, that you're not a valued member of community. This is just a people that understand the world in a completely different way than somebody who only speaks English, right? And so what we need to do, and we need to do this now, is to start learning our languages, is to counter colonization. Our existence shouldn't be revolutionary, but in this time and age, it is. And so an act of our revolutionary praxis is learning our language, and it is reconnecting with community, and it's collaborating with other community members and people with opposing ways of thinking than you, right? There are a lot of elders with opposing ways of thinking. Sometimes you get these family clashes, right, in community. And so what I'm recommending, now is the time to break Bannock, right? Because some of those people, they're language speakers, or they got bush knowledge, right? And that's deeper than any doctorate, and I'm going for my doctorates here at the University of Alberta. But that says a lot, right? That I'm this young going for a doctorate, but it's going to take me a lot longer to be an elder, right? And so those are the people that really have earned the knowledge, right? It's relatively easy to get your doctorates, but you have to have a lifetime of knowledge to become an elder. And so those are the people that I'm really recommending, people that are listening to this, that you engage with and that you listen to, even if they're have opposing or contrary thoughts sometimes.
It's such an important piece, because I was just speaking of that to my students about how our elders or grandmothers, really, I kind of frame the role of grandmothers and the knowledge of grandmothers as they guide all my teaching and my research. And our conversation the other day, when you spoke about In Your Game, which congratulations, can't wait to play it. Just what you showed me, I was excited about it, and I'm like, oh my goodness, we need to do one in Michif. We need to, and we started talking about how this desire has been there to use that technology. I remember when some of my friends in the Mushkwegwak said, let's do virtual reality to bring that language back. But there's an important piece that you shared, and it just stayed, really touched me when you spoke about how language revitalization is not an individual activity, number one, right? And that's clear and that's evident. It has to be that engagement. And even though we might not speak the language, made me think about how we live the language, because I am not sure if this is in your game or we spoke about it. And then I just saw somewhat a little bit more clearly about what happens when we don't have the language. Because it's how we think, how we be, how we act, how we are in relation. And then you went further, and I think in your game you go further to show what happens to our sacred ecosystem. Do we hear the birds, the trees? What happens to our river? And I was teaching Indigenous health and well-being, and I put language at the center, but as how it is interconnected to all of these elements. And so you kind of opened my world in our 5 minutes of you showing me the game, of seeing points of intersection that I kind of knew, but my awareness was completely deepened. So imagine then playing the game, what that will deepen or awake or invite, and then to think about revitalization in a much more complex, which I'm sure those who are deeply involved in language revitalization, you're thinking about it through governance. I think about it through wellness, through it's not just about learning the word, is how do we live that word. And at a recent our Métis Studies conference last month, Maria Campbell spoke about have a relationship to that word. Be in relation, choose one, be in relation to it, because, and so, those are some of my reflections on your sharing, and also on your passion of this pro game. And I'm like, really, I could create a video, Kyle, on YouTube video? I mean, I'm a Pac-Man girl. Remember 30 years ago, this is what I know. And I'm like, Florence, can you imagine that this becomes potentially part of our curriculum, potentially because increasingly my assignments are creative projects. It's like, let's move out of that, always one way of producing knowledge and being co-creators and knowledge making, but that could potentially be part of what we engage with our students and with community. Like, so excited to bring that with me when I travel home to Saskatchewan, Kyle, because the Michif language revitalization there is occurring, as you know, and as we've discussed. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts and reflections and enthusiasm with what's occurring, and as an act of resistance also, like you said, like there's something more deeply about why we need to be doing what we're doing, or just to affirm that, right, and to celebrate that and honor that. So merci.
Kyle, I know we're coming close to the end, but I'm going to invite you to share a final thought, a final hope for the future in the work you're doing. You mentioned that you are about to start a PhD program at the University of Alberta. But I invite you to share with us your final words for this time together.
Thank you. Merci. Now is a really fascinating time to be an Indigenous person in the area of scholarship or the academy or knowledge, or even plumbing and carpentry and just existing, right? These last few hundred years have been a very strange time for us as Indigenous peoples on this continent. And so, but these last few years, right, since the TRC, since and I hate to bring this up, but it needs to be brought up. But since the bodies are being uncovered on these residential schools, now places the onus on the rest of Canadian society to realize what has been happening. And so, right, there are a bit of eyes are turning to us now as Indigenous peoples. Well, who are you? What's your existence? And so now it's a great time for us to figure out what that means. And so just extending that for anyone who is considering the University of Alberta for scholarship or for attendance or for community, right? Whether as somebody who works there or as somebody who studies there, it might seem as though you don't have that community around you in your classroom. But if you start listening, or if you start walking down the halls, you'll realize there are more of us, Indigenous peoples, walking down the halls discreetly, covertly, holding space, holding time, and holding knowledge, and sharing that knowledge in our own ways, in our own communities. So I just encourage you, if you are here, if you are on campus, to seek out those relationships, seek out those spaces, the conferences, the places where there's tea and Bannock. Yeah, break Bannock. Like, there are just so many wonderful places to learn and grow and develop relationships, and now's the time to do it. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kyle. And we're so appreciative of your teaching and the wisdom that you've shared with us today. And to our audience members, thank you for joining us over the last 13 moons. And as we celebrate the completion of a one cycle of presenting our presence, we look forward to the future topics that we'll explore and cover and the humans that are in our presence that we have not yet come to know. So grateful. And I want to try then Masi Cho and Ishnish. Hi, and trying to pull together some of those words, because how do we come to learn language? First of all, connecting and feeling it. And I think it was a beautiful reminder with the heart, and Maria's words, what relationship do you have? So grateful. Thank you all.
Super, thank you all. And Kyle, we were talking, Florence, that we haven't met in person yet. So looking forward to a visit in person in the summer or the fall. And it will be great to have you at the U of A as a student, as a colleague, as a, human being that we can actually go meet and have tea together in person and practice.
And break Bannock.
And break Bannock together.
Wow, what a good visit.
So good.
Yeah.
So good.
We're done with the formality part though.
Stop